We are back here on the NFL podcast here on NoCoastBias.com. I am Farzin Vasugian alongside Robert Zaglinski. It's down to the two of us. Looks like we're losing a number each week. Last week it was me. Lost a couple guys this week, but hopefully we'll get the rest of the crew back next week. And look, we've all got our personal lives, so we'll surely rotate every now and then. But nonetheless, we are back. As long as we've got at least two people, we'll definitely have the podcast. And Robert Zaglinski is here joining me. Robert, how's it going, man?
Pretty good, man. How's it going? How are those Royals?
Oh, man, it's crazy. It's the whole town is blue. I don't know if you saw this, but the national media picked up on this. There are people, lots of people went to the parade downtown. People parked their cars on the highway and they walked over. There were already buses, shuttles offering to drive people from the suburbs to downtown. I mean, people stranded their cars and then they walked over to downtown. I mean, it looked like a zombie apocalypse started, basically.
And people say sports don't matter. Oh, Kansas City. Happiness.
Gosh, Chiefs haven't won a Super Bowl since 1970. Royals haven't won since 85. You know, I told you this before the show. Our soccer teams won a couple titles, but and look, our city loves soccer, but let's face it, they're not going to take a day off and have that long parade downtown. But it's incredible, man. You know, I know you're a Chicago guy. You've experienced championships. This is my first big-time, big league professional championships. I've seen my Jayhawks win an Orange Bowl and a national title, but it's nice, man. I can finally say I know how it feels. I'm finally a little late, but better to be late than never.
Welcome to the big leagues. Proud of you. I'm proud of you.
Indeed. Indeed. It's been an incredible season. I was hoping to go against your Cubs because I know how it feels for those Chicago Cubs fans. It's been a while, so I know the feeling in a way. But gosh, for Cubs fans who have been alive for a long time, it's been a while.
Yeah, let's not pour salt in the wound. Let's get to it.
Hey man, I'm hoping the Cubs do it one day. All right, let's jump into it. This isn't baseball talk. We're here for NFL football talk, and it's been it was. And look, I'll admit, I watched the Chiefs because they were on early, and then I knew I was going to watch the Royals game, so I had a life in the middle of the day. But even then, it just seemed like there was a really quiet football Sunday. But the biggest matchup this week, the most anticipated one, and I'm sure this drew a lot of ratings on Sunday Night Football, but that undefeated matchup there between the Broncos and the Packers. By the way, first time ever in NFL history, 4 teams are 7-0 at this point. So crazy. Usually just one team at this point, but the Broncos are one of those teams. And look, we all thought that Denver's offensive woes, it was going to come back to haunt Denver, but we saw a completely different Peyton Manning in this game, and goes out, has his best statistic in terms of throwing yards, no touchdowns, but hey, the running game handled that for Peyton Manning. The Broncos found a way to win this football game, and Rodgers in check. This Broncos team dominated, and this was really their first balanced victory of the season. And look, a win is a win, but this is the kind of win you need to have if you want to extend your season into January and perhaps February.
No, you mentioned it. I want to note first, you weren't here last week, but when we picked this game, Nate and Danny picked the Packers, and yours truly picked the Broncos. So I like to say I got something going. But no, in check is, I think the offensive performance goes without standing. I felt that when I picked the Broncos, that Peyton would have 2 weeks to sort of rest his arm. I mean, he is older, right? Rest his body, and then they had 2 weeks to game plan for a relatively weak Packers defense. And to say that they kept Aaron Rodgers in check, that just doesn't do it justice. Aaron Rodgers threw for less than 100 yards for the first time in his career. Matt Castle threw for 97 yards on Sunday and threw for 20 more than Aaron Rodgers. I've never seen Aaron Rodgers play through it. Watching the game, I watched the game, and you see Aaron Rodgers doing his typical pocket presence, moving his feet around. He's actually getting plenty of time, but he just has no one to throw it to. He just had nowhere to go with the ball, and he looked visibly frustrated. I've never seen that. This Broncos defense, we've talked about it at length throughout this season. It might be one of the best defenses ever in the NFL. And if Peyton Manning can play like that, like it was sort of game managing, you mentioned how he didn't really throw any touchdown passes. They're pretty scary. They're pretty scary to say the least.
And look, let's get into it. They just got a little bit scarier because they added Vernon Davis. Think about this. Vernon Davis was on a 2-7 football team. Now he's on a team that's undefeated and really wants a Super Bowl. Look, if you have Peyton Manning, first of all, if you're the Denver Broncos, ever since you acquired Peyton Manning, you have been number one in the AFC every single season. A couple of early exits for the Denver Broncos, and then you had that brutal Super Bowl loss to Seattle, the most one-sided Super Bowl game in NFL history. This Broncos team, it's win or bust, and you replace Julius Thomas, who obviously moved on with Jacksonville. You replace him with Vernon Davis, who had a really good career in San Francisco, and look, the Broncos ended up not paying a high price, giving up a 6th-round pick in 2016 and 2017 at 7-0. Denver with Vernon Davis, that's huge for Peyton Manning. As we just said, and as we said throughout the season, this has been kind of a funny Broncos team, a great defense with a bad Peyton Manning team under center. You just saw Peyton Manning had the best game of his season, and now I think there's a reason to believe that he's going to start doing better. How do you forecast Peyton Manning's second half of 2015?
It'll be interesting to note how he plays once the weather gets colder. That's something that we have to watch. Obviously, if his body can take it, but we've noted how the Broncos have been sort of running a hybrid of the offense he ran in Peyton ran in Indianapolis, the spread offense, and zone read scheme with Gary Kubiak and play action. It seems he's really comfortable in it, and it seems like he's sort of accepting that John Elway role. Listen, Peyton's not going to have to be lights out. Peyton's going for 250 and a touchdown or two and letting the defense sort of take control of the game. We've been talking – we've talked before about how the Bengals are the number one contender to the Patriots. I'm not so sure about that anymore, especially if Peyton's finally accepting his role.
Well, see, the thing that really interests me with this trade with Vernon Davis going to Indianapolis, I mean, Peyton Manning has had success in the past with tight ends. We saw what he did with Julius Thomas the past couple of years. And look, a lot of people are wondering, was Julius Thomas, was his success a product of Peyton Manning? Sure, you could say that, but at the same time, it's not like this is the only tight end that Manning has dominated with. We saw Dallas Clark, and look, I think we've got to give Dallas Clark more credit than he got because he was overshadowed by Reggie Wayne and Marvin Harrison for plenty of his time over at Indianapolis. So Peyton Manning, when he sees a good tight end, he'll work with them, and he'll do a lot of damage on opposing teams. I mean, Broncos team that I think can step it up offensively. It's just, you know, and we see this a lot with some really good athletes who are just inconsistent. It's just, what Peyton Manning are we going to see week in and week out? Because Peyton Manning, sure, he's had a bad season, but a great career. But whatever we see in week 8 compared to week 9, I mean, that's the change that we want to see. I mean, which Peyton Manning do we see, and can we see an improvement each week?
Yeah, no, we're just going to have to watch how I mean, obviously he had a bye week going into this sort of season capping game. We're going to see how he's able to manage his body and keep going for because obviously he's the biggest question for this Broncos team. I mean, I'm not, unless you disagree, if Peyton Manning plays at that level, they're the best. They look like the best team in the league. If Peyton Manning can play at a game managing level, they're the best team in the league. They have the best roster, and it seems like they can just run on all cylinders. So it's just something that we have to keep an eye on. As we build hype for it, Manning Brady 16 or 17 comes in about 2 or 3 weeks. So that's when we can really gauge how things go, how Peyton plays against the Patriots. But for now, just take it week by week with this Broncos team.
I just want to say one thing, and I'll admit a little bias because I love defenses. Plus, Denver does have a couple of KU guys, but even so, look at Chicago in 2006, and I'm sure you can attest to this with how they made it to the Super Bowl with Rex Grossman under center. I mean, they almost won the whole thing, and Peyton didn't have a very good Super Bowl game, if I recall correctly. But listen, the thing with this Denver defense, if they can continue to hold teams down and get all those takeaways, you can go out there and win a lot of low-scoring games. Look, whatever it takes to win. That's what Denver's done all season. And we'll get to Green Bay in a second. Do you have any final thoughts on Denver before we go on to Green Bay?
No, I just like I said, I want to see I'm not going to judge them as much off of the week to week, even though that's what we should do. I want to see how they play against the Patriots. They're going to have a game against the Bengals on the final Monday night game of the year. I want to see how they're doing against the elite teams that they're going to have to beat in the postseason. And then just as a funny note, I mean, Peyton Manning at 38 or 39 is still a completely different caliber than Rex Grossman to put them in position for a possible championship run. But that's just my final thoughts there on Denver.
Broncos are 7-0. So are the Patriots and Bengals, as you mentioned, and also the Carolina Panthers. We'll get into the Panthers later in one of our key games for this week, as they had a crazy Monday Night Football victory. But one of the teams that was undefeated, the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, we just touched on the Broncos. The Broncos were the team that handed the Packers their first loss of the season. Robert, you said you wanted to touch on this a little bit, and I'll let you kind of take charge of this topic, but you kind of feel like Green Bay, maybe they've been getting too much credit this season. Is that fair to say? Why do you think so?
I think, in my mind, Green Bay has been getting a lot too much credit in the last few seasons overall. Listen, this team has the best quarterback in the league by any measure, Aaron Rodgers. I mean, the best pocket presence, the smartest guy. He's just almost impossible to stop when he's on, and he's almost on every week. And loaded offensive cast, a great offensive line, but this defense isn't anything to write home about. I mean, people were looking at this team as the second best team in the league, or the best because they have Rodgers, but there's no balance. If we look at right now, they're 18th in the league in defense, and they just let up 500 yards to a Broncos offense that was struggling tremendously, 160 yards rushing. Last year, they were 15th overall, 25th overall in 2013, 11th in 2012, so a bit of a step up. And then they were last in the NFL in 2011. So this isn't exactly a new problem, but people have sort of been giving them the benefit of the doubt because of what Rodgers is. It reminds me a lot of Peyton's early Indianapolis years where it was all him, but there just wasn't as much balance struck on the other side of the ball where they were built to play with the lead. I mentioned this to you before the show. I wouldn't even put them in the top three. I mean, in my mind, it's probably the Patriots, Broncos, Bengals, and then Green Bay, just because there's nothing on the defensive side of the ball that makes me think that they're a reasonable contender in relation to those teams.
So, and let me just make sure I have this clearly, and I've had this topic before in the past, but you think Green Bay's defense, more specifically, just is overrated because of the amount of yards they've given up, not just this week, but kind of different portions throughout the season. Is that right?
I think they're overrated because of the amount of yards they've given up. Yes, I mean they let up 500 yards to Phillip Rivers and a mediocre San Diego team. They haven't exactly been playing lights out. Their rushing defense is primarily the reason for these defensive rankings that I mentioned. Teams can really push them around. I mean, you look back at the NFC Championship game. They were in control for the majority of that game, and in the final few minutes, the final half of the quarter, Seattle turned on the ground game. Into end of story, really, end of story. At that point, I can't trust them.
Let me say this, because I remember a couple of years ago, the Patriots were 32nd in the NFL in total yards allowed on defense, and people said, "Whoa, this is the best time to beat the Patriots because they don't have a good defense, so maybe you could win in a high-scoring game." Number one, 9 times out of 10, Tom Brady is going to win a high-scoring game. Second of all, just because you are 32nd in the NFL in total defense, that doesn't mean you are necessarily the worst defense. It just means you've given up the most yards. Now, I will say this. That's very bad. Don't get me wrong. I do want to say that I think my point is I feel like those total yards numbers can be a little deceiving. Look,
sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's a little deceiving because sometimes you think of garbage stats. Because the key stat I want to point out here, Green Bay, as you mentioned, they are 18th in total defense or total yards allowed on the season, whereas total points they've given up, they're the 6th best defensive team when it comes to scores allowed. So I think you kind of, the way I judge teams defensively is how much points they give up per game. I disagree with you. I think Green Bay, look, they've had a couple bad games defensively, but as long as they're not they're still keeping opponents down, not letting them light up the scoreboard. Sure, get all the yards you want. The only thing that matters is how can you get into the end zone.
It's not just for me. It's not just the yardage allowed. They also Football Outsiders, who do great work with Aaron Schatz. They're in the bottom of the league in DVOA, which is like the advanced defensive statistics. So they're not exactly. I mean, scoring defense doesn't do the amount of justice to their middling defensive performance. I just can't trust them. And listen, this isn't my Bears bias for anyone that's listened to our podcast. Like Green Bay, literally, I can't trust their they don't have that. I mean, Clay Matthews is out of position from his normal spot, so he's not creating as much in the pass rush. He's playing middle linebacker instead of outside, so he hasn't been producing as much as he did earlier in his career as a superstar pass rusher. I mean, they have a few nice guys, but that team is built on Aaron Rodgers. If Aaron Rodgers doesn't play well, which can very well happen, or even if he has like a game of 240 yards and 2 touchdowns, and it's not a typical virtuoso performance for him, they are very vulnerable. I just don't think they have enough balance to be, and more than likely they still win the NFC because the rest of the NFC just can't beat Rodgers. But once they get into February, whoever they play, I can't trust them.
Well, you did say February. My question to you is going to be, do you think the Packers are that potential number 1 or number 2 seed that gets a bye week and then next thing you know, hey, they're one and done in the postseason?
Depends on who they play. If they play, say, someone like Seattle, who maybe can get into a groove, even though I'm extremely still concerned about them, or some kind of power rushing team like Carolina who can keep the ball away from Rodgers, then yes, they can absolutely be one and done. But if they're playing someone that they don't have to be necessarily concerned about, that can push them around defensively, I mean, they'll be playing on February 7th otherwise.
Yeah, and I do agree with you. Let me just make that clear because I know Green Bay's defense, it hasn't been great, sure, the scoring-wise, but when you're playing some of these look, I will say, Phillip Rivers, he's always been on a team that's just never been balanced. There were a couple good years where that defense was stacked in San Diego, but overall, as long as you have Phillip Rivers, going to have a good offense in San Diego. The past 2 weeks, Green Bay has faced a good offense in Phillip Rivers, and I don't know what to call him at this point. Are the Broncos a good offense? Are they not? But, well, for what it's worth, he is Peyton Manning. And, yeah, no, I agree. You're shaking your head no. But this is a defensive team that's allowed offenses to move the ball on them pretty well. So we will see how that unfolds for Green Bay. I do want to go back to the AFC West for a second with the Oakland Raiders. I think this is really one of the more intriguing teams, a team that's really turned things around. They were the last team to pick up a victory in the NFL. This year, if the season ended today, they own the 5th spot in the AFC. They are in the play. Ended today. Here, the Raiders, like I said, currently would visit the Colts if the postseason ended. The Raiders just have been really, really bad since that Super Bowl loss to Tampa Bay. We've seen so many head coaches just go in, come in, and events every couple of years with head coaches. And, of course, the passing of Al Davis, he really wanted to see a championship. But are we finally seeing that historic black and silver Raiders team turn things around and become relevant once again?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, listen, what's the most important position in the NFL in order to restabilize things? I mean, you can maybe build yourself a defense, but if you find yourself a quarterback and build a decent enough offensive line around him, and give him weapons, you're going to be relevant. And they still have room to grow. They're going to get even better. I have to say, of all the young quarterbacks, people have been giving Andrew Luck the most hype. People have been giving who else? Teddy Bridgewater, Blake Bortles. Derek Carr looks like a 5-year vet right now. How he's able to stay composed and the way he's performing. I mean, to me, the Raiders are building themselves into an AFC powerhouse, no matter how premature that sounds, within the next few years. This is only the beginning.
I agree. Yeah, I think we finally see the Raiders taking turn. I really like their draft this year. I really did. I think the Raiders found some good pieces in that draft. I don't know if they're all going to be impact starters right away. Look, there are teams that have really it may take some time time for the Raiders to really develop, and now they're kind of joining forces with guys like past couple of now they're adding big pieces to the puzzle, and the puzzle's starting to get complete. I think in 2016, and look, we'll see what happens with Peyton Manning. I'm really interested to see how an NFL team functions without Peyton Manning, because we've always seen the Colts and Broncos dominate when they have Peyton Manning, and then when the Colts lose him, they get the number one draft pick. When and if Peyton Manning does retire, which I think is going to be this season, that Oakland Raiders team, I think they could West. Listen, and I'm not going to lie about this. I've done it too. Estimated Oakland. I still remember talk radio and just making fun of that Thursday night football game last year, and looking at what the Chiefs did, just choking there. No, the Raiders win that game, and this is a team that I think has really turned a corner. I think they've got a right head coach here, and I think they're going to move forward. I think Derek Carr is a very good quarterback. I think Derek Carr, this might be crazy to say, I think Breeze and Manning, after those guys retire, I think Derek Carr is going to be that next top-tier quarterback in the NFL, and he's going to help the Raiders get to maybe one, possibly multiple championships.
I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit it, I have a slight man crush on Derek Carr, the way he plays in that arm. But you look at the landscape of the AFC too. Like you just mentioned it, you're saying after all these top tier guys retire, when Brady's gone soon, within the next few years, I mean he's going to say.
Well, he says he has 10 years. He says he has 10 years.
Well, I'm going realistically. When Brady's gone within the next few years, Peyton's gone. You mentioned it, probably maybe retiring this year. Ben Roethlisberger's 34, 35. Joe Flacco's 31, 32, but that Ravens team needs to rebuild. The Raiders, with another draft or two, are probably going to be the Titan of the AFC for a good while. I mean, as long as Derek Carr's quarterback, you have to look at it. You have to look at it that way, and it's impressive enough to say that they have pieces on both sides of the ball. They still have to do some kind of adjust. They still need to find some corners, some better secondary play, because their defense is middling. But they have the pass rushers, for example, Khalil Mack, Alden Smith. They're well on their way. And they're in place to be dominant for a long time.
Yeah, like I said, the veterans that they've had, that they've drafted the past couple of years, and I think this year's draft class, that's helped to right now be a playoff team. And one last thought, Jack Del Rio, I love what he did in Jacksonville, especially defensively. I know Garrard, he had some good moments there with the Jaguars before things went bad for him. But look, he goes to Denver, really helps that defense. And I think Jack Del Rio deserves that Denver defense is right now. It's just unfortunate that he has to go up against them twice a year now. But Jack Del Rio, I think the Raiders are definitely moving to prominence. Speaking of head coaches, though, Robert, I do want to touch on Ken Whisenhunt, who was terminated by the Tennessee Titans earlier this week, and in fact, just Tuesday morning. And this is the second head coach to lose his job. We saw Philbin get terminated, I think, after the first 4 games of the season. And look, Detroit recently let go of its offensive coordinator. They went through a crazy offensive shift. Colts just changed their offensive coordinator. I want to go. Are you with me, Robert?
I'm here.
Okay. Sorry, I think I may have misspoke. I don't know if I said the Colts or in case I said the Colts. The Lions recently went through a crazy offensive shift, firing their offensive coordinator and also 2 position coaches. The Colts just fired their offensive coordinator, and Whisenhunt fired by the Titans. What do you think of coach? We just reached the halfway point, and we've seen 2 head coaches, a couple of offensive assistants get fired at this point in the season. Do you see any reason, any benefit a team to change head coaches this season before the halfway point? I know it happens a lot in December, but before the season or before the midway point, what do you think?
I think it's sort of scapegoating the team struggles, if anything. It's not – listen, if a head coach loses his team, you're not exactly going to change the culture and turn the season around if you fire them at the mid-season point. There's literally, in my mind, no benefit to say like the Titans are firing Ken Wisenhunt. What difference is it if they're going to get rid of him now versus the end of the season instead of letting him leave honorably by any sense? That team's probably the least talented team in the NFL. They just lost to the Texans, who have been railed week after week by other teams. The Colts are starting their own scapegoat tour as also one of the worst teams in the league. So they fired Pep Hamilton. They continue down this spiral. I mean, Pagano might be next. Firing a coach at midseason is literally a scapegoat measure. I want to link back to the Bears, because the Bears historically in franchise history, whenever they've had a lame duck coach, they let them play through the season because the ownership is by any measure realistic. I mean, it hasn't served us well because we haven't won a Super Bowl in a long time, but by any measure, they're realistic. And they don't, like, say for example, Mark Trestman. Mark Trestman should have been gone after they got blown out back-to-back by the Patriots and Packers. I'm not sure if you remember that. He should have been gone after that. And there's even been stories recently. I linked you a story about where he made Jeremiah Ratliff a captain after he destroyed the practice field. Mark Trestman should have been gone way before the end of the season. But it wouldn't have made a difference. It wouldn't have made it. The Bears wouldn't have suddenly played different. They wouldn't have gone all Dan Campbell and got two irrelevant wins against bad teams. It wouldn't have made a difference. And I don't understand the logic here with the Titans or the Colts or the Lions and making their own coaching changes.
I'll say this. A lot of head coaches, if they don't get fired during the offseason, they get fired a couple weeks before the end of the season, which is and Christmas time. I can't recall who it is. I know you know the name, but there was a Chicago head Bulls coach on Christmas Eve who got fired.
Scott Skiles. He's the current head coach of the Orlando Magic.
See, I remember that happened, and I remember some people in the media saying wrong move to fire someone during Christmas time. And to me, it's like, you can't think that way because just the way the schedule's built. It just so happens that, I mean, look, let's face it, owners and general managers know what direction they're going in the offseason midway through. They're doing that. I mean, they know as to whether or not they want to let somebody go. And listen, in the NFL, you should keep up December. You should keep head coaches, I think, through late November, December, January, if your season goes that far. Because the thing is, I think you've got to let coaches play out and see what they can do as long as possible. Now, I do agree. I think if you want to cut the cord, do it, because the eight lots of coaches that fire head coaches. And guess what? In January, it's a scramble for head coaching name that's available. Who knows who that could be? But if you fire a guy like the Dolphins and Titans have so far this year, guess what? The Dolphins and Titans are ahead of the 8 ball. Surely they're calling a couple of head coaches' agents saying, hey, look, it's between us, but we've got a head coaching job available. We'd love for you. Think you need to do it so early. I don't know why you do it Amy or halfway. Your 10 coaches go out a little bit. And if you really think it's time to pull the cord, do it December. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, you wait. You should wait till the end of the season, sort of give yourself I like that point, giving yourself a jump on top head coaching candidates. But listen, that in my mind, that doesn't make much of a difference either. You're gonna find your top candidate regardless. Rather, listen, you're already, if you know you're gonna, for example, with the Bears and Mark Trestman, they knew they were gonna let him go regardless of the season anyway. So they were already nailing down their list. They were already nailing down their guys because they also changed their general manager. So they were already nailing down a list, and they're already calling candidates. You don't necessarily. It's not. I feel like the point I tried to make earlier. I feel like these teams are trying to send a message to the rosters, like no one is safe, or it's time to change things around. Like, again, it's the Titans.
Especially, let me just add this. Especially guys who are fighting for a contract. If they're in their contract year, owners and general managers send a message, say, hey, look, you just saw this head coach of yours go who's been working with you all offseason, if you want to come back. So, yeah, I do agree. It does send a message.
I don't know. In my mind, it's a very subjective thing because this is something we should have brought up. Jim Caldwell, the current head coach of the Lions, who will probably be fired at the end of the year, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
He was the offense. He was an offensive assistant with the Ravens, and John Harbaugh fired Cam Cameron in the middle of the 2012 season, or with I believe in week 10 or week 11, after an embarrassing loss to the Broncos. The offense stabilized. They started using the ground game more, and they went on to win the Super Bowl. So it's a very subjective thing, and you're not sure how it's going to go. Maybe if you're expected to be a contending team and you have the talent, maybe it's worth it to make some kind of staff change if you think it's really going to spark your roster. But other than that, it's a shoulder shrug type thing.
Filling in for the Titans, as we mentioned, the termination of Ken Whisenhunt, it is Mike Mularkey. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is tough being in the NFL in Hard Knocks, and it's pretty tough when players and coaches have to change jobs so much because they have to go with their families, or maybe they don't. And if they don't, it's a tough life having your wife and kids perhaps on a different coast. So hopefully he can find himself a home. The thing about the Titans, and I don't want to touch on this too much as we've got a couple other topics to move on with, they've got a very good young quarterback in Mariota. We cast if they find the right head coach, and look, coaching can make a big difference. I think that Titans team can go from being really bad to really good. It's just coaching up Mariota and then bringing in the right guys. That can make a big difference over at Tennessee. Speaking of other teams in the AFC, as we've touched on a lot of teams in the AFC, let's go to one of the biggest threats in the AFC, the Cincinnati Bengals. You know my thoughts. I've said this balanced team offensively and defensively. Bengals looked really bad. They were trailing 10-6 going into the fourth quarter against the Steelers. However, Cincinnati rallies and goes 10 unanswered points against the Steelers. And look, Le'Veon Bell's injury played a role, which we'll get into in a moment. But nonetheless, you never apologize if an opposing team loses a player due to injury. They just start playing bad all of a sudden in the second half. You go out there, and if you can rally late in less than 3 minutes, score 10 points, you do so no matter how it comes. A win is a win in the National Football League, and the Bengals continue to impress. This is a Bengals team. I think we mentioned this earlier, and you mentioned the potential matchup with the Broncos and the Bengals later on in the season, late in the season. I think this is probably the best team in the AFC. I know we both agree that Denver has to show more, because as of right now, Cincinnati has proven itself throughout the season. I think Cincinnati is the best team in the AFC right now.
Well, other than New England, right?
No, I really like our defense. I really do.
I'm not sure if I'll necessarily agree. I mean, they're up there, but they're probably, they're probably the 1A. No, but what I wanted to touch about this game, because you're mentioning it, Andy Dalton didn't play his best game in the first half. It looked like the typical Red Rifle game where just everything falls and dissipates around him. But he rallied and he played well and he got his team together and he didn't let the Bengals fall apart. And a late touchdown pass to A.J. Green in the final few minutes of the fourth quarter. And Dalton's been the guy that's been holding back the Bengals for years now, right? They've had the same talented roster, the same coaching staff, same type of discipline, but it's been Dalton in big games or in playoff games that hasn't performed up to snuff. No, he started off badly, and he rallied himself away from his typical past performances. If he continues this kind of growth, I mean, I'm going to have to agree that they're better than the Patriots. But at this point, again, I might not be able to say that I need to see more. We might have seen everything we need to see.
Yeah, look, I mean, to me, it was one bad game, but I still think the Bengals are really doing a great job. I don't want to say they're running things in the AFC because there are two other undefeated teams. So I think that there's other things have to happen if we want to say that they're in control of the AFC. But nonetheless, it's a football team that I think has been really impressive. And not many people saw. We could probably say that we thought the Broncos. It just depends on how you saw the Broncos or how you viewed the Broncos. There are probably some people out there who thought the Broncos would be dominant. The Patriots, look, who doesn't think the Patriots were going to dominate this year, regardless of the distractions they had in the offseason? But the Bengals, definitely a pleasant surprise, and they've done a great job. Whereas the Steelers, it's been kind of the opposite for them this year. They lose Le'Veon Bell to a torn MCL early in the game and out for the season, and they just got back Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, you really have a lot of talent on that Steelers offense. You get back your quarterback, but you lose your all-star running back. And as of right now, you have to wonder, what is the state of the Steelers at 4-4 at the halfway point of the season? Because this is a team that can contend. I mean, realistically, they are right there with the Raiders and a couple other teams for a wild card spot in the AFC. But with the loss of Le'Veon Bell, and look, Ben Roethlisberger is a great quarterback, but you do lose a great piece right there. Sure, they could do it if they go pass heavy, but they're 4-4 right now. It's doubtful they win the division because we all know about the Bengals. The Bengals do run the AFC North. We can at least say that. But the Steelers, they've got to get going, because if they don't, they're going to fall behind in the wild card spot. We know the only way to win for the Steelers to get into the postseason is by winning a wild card spot. They're in position to make the playoffs if they can do well. But as of right now, it's not looking too hot for the Steelers. What do you think is the state of the Steelers right now for the 2015 season?
I wouldn't say it's in shambles because, again, like you mentioned it, they can go pass heavy. Ben Roethlisberger has sort of made the transition to be able to be that guy that can throw the ball 30 to 40 times a game. They still have their receivers. They still have their offensive line is still relatively stable. The defense is actually playing much better. Not the steel curtain by any measure, but they're starting to play much better. And if you look at it, I disagree that they're a contending team. I mean, what is your definition of a contender? First of all,
to me, as long as you can contend, as long as you have an opportunity, look at the Colts right now. They're a really bad football team, but as long as somehow, and again, I get the division sucks in the South, but if you are in position to play in the postseason, if you can play in January, guess what? January is a brand new season. Everyone's 0-0. And who knows? Maybe we see a team with an 8-8 or 7-9 record make a surge. We've seen 7-9 teams win. The Panthers did it. The Saints did it. As long as you have a realistic opportunity to make the playoffs, I think the Steelers are a contender right now to at least make the playoffs. By all means, not a championship contender. I'm saying just a postseason.
Oh, contender. A playoff contender? No, absolutely no. So you look at the AFC. The AFC is incredibly top heavy. You have those three undefeated teams: the Bengals, Patriots, and Broncos. The AFC South is completely irrelevant. The AFC South is going to have that playoff team is by any measure just a technical playoff team. And then we're talking about for two wild card spots. You have the Raiders, the Jets, and the Steelers. Unless I'm mistaken by someone else in the standings. I'm looking at the standings right now. So it's the Raiders, the Jets, and the Steelers. The 4-4 Steelers, the 4-3 Raiders, the 4-3 Jets. So who has the two best quarterbacks of those three teams? The Raiders and the Steelers.
Yeah, I agree.
Steelers, they're just fine. I mean, they don't have the easiest schedule either. So, but they have the Raiders coming up, so it's a key game for them. Maybe to vault themselves over for a wild card spot. They have the Browns, then the bye week, then they're at Seattle. Who knows how well Seattle's playing, or if Seattle's even going to turn around the way they're playing right now. Then they have the Colts. That's probably a win. At Bengals, another iffy start, but it's a divisional rivalry. Then they're home against the Broncos. Then they're at the Ravens, and then at the Browns. I mean, 8 or 9, maybe 10 wins, and that still probably gets them in. Just because they have Ben Roethlisberger. So I mean, they're fine. They're a playoff contending team, like you said. There's a difference. They're a playoff contending team.
We'll get to the Steelers in a moment with our key games for the week. It's as long as you have Roethlisberger, I think that opportunity is still there. Obviously, with Le'Veon Bell, your chances go up. But even so, up to this point, even though you have had Le'Veon Bell, it's just this Steelers team just hasn't been living up to expectations. So right now, the pressure is on Roethlisberger. We'll get into them later as we'll find out really what we think of the Steelers. And it all starts this week when they have their key game. But the first key game we want to touch on, I think this is clearly the game of the week. 6-1 Green Bay Packers just lost their first game of the season visiting the 7-0 Panthers. Panthers just had a crazy victory on Monday Night Football, almost allowed Indianapolis to come back, but they handled business. Fun fact, that was actually the first overtime game in NFL history to have 3 field goals. We know the new rule where every team has an opportunity. Both teams scored a field goal in their first chance on the first drive of their overtime games, but the Panthers came out with a game-winning field goal, so that led to 3 total by both teams. Nonetheless, the Packers, they are hungry. They cannot afford to lose 2 in a row. They want that number 1 seed. Ultimately, this game at the end of the season, whoever loses might look back and say, hey, look, this is the reason we gave away the number 1 seed. And home field is crucial, especially at a place like Green Bay at Lambeau Field. You definitely want it if you're Green Bay. Now, the Panthers get to prove themselves again. A lot of people have gotten on this bandwagon after what they've done lately. And like I said, the Packers, they don't want to drop 2 in a row. Who do you have winning this game?
I'm going to give myself a nice segue from my original defensive rant. I think Carolina is more than equipped. I mean, Carolina isn't the best offensive team in terms of explosiveness, but Newton in the option game and Jonathan Stewart, I think they can and will push around the Packers front. Nothing impressive by any measure, 100+ rushing yards and keep the ball away from Aaron Rodgers and come out on top or come out on top and put themselves in an excellent place for the number 1 seed.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've got to go with the Panthers in this one because I just really like what Cam Newton has done this year. I loved him coming out of college, just the things that he's been able to do and trying to do that now in the NFL. And I think Cam Newton and that defense, you mentioned the defense, it really came through clutch in overtime. I think that defines the Panthers defense. Even though they allowed a lot in the second half, they still held it together and came through. Didn't allow the Colts get into the end zone at the end of that game, and in overtime got that pick, able to stay on their toes, tipped right there. I think the Panthers pull away, and they'll be in the driver's seat for the number 1 seed.
You mentioned Newton. Before we move on to our next pick, you mentioned Newton. Really quickly, if you picked your top 3 MVP candidates, who would it be?
Oh gosh, off the top of my head, I've got to include Carson Palmer in there because the way he's come back, and I think he's also viable for candidate of the year, or pardon me, a candidate for a comeback player of the year. But I've got to go with Carson Palmer as one of the guys. I think Cam Newton has to be there, especially that game he had against Seattle. I think that was his coming out party. And I say that loosely because we all know what Cam Newton is capable of. But this year, people were not on this bandwagon yet. And when we saw what he did to Seattle, yeah, you were. I do recall that. But when people saw what he did, a lot of people said, all right, I'm sold on this Panthers team. I think Cam Newton is a candidate. And then, as always, I think Tom Brady is up there just because he's always been on a dominant Patriots team. But I think it'd be cool if Cam Newton won it. If I had to give one right now, I would probably go to Carson Palmer. And I think it more so has to do with the fact that how he's come back. I know what I'm saying maybe is more specific for comeback player of the year. But I think without him, we saw what happened to Arizona last year. Without him, I don't think this Arizona football team is where they are right now. So I've got to give it to Palmer. I think Cam Newton and Tom Brady are right behind him.
Okay. I won't necessarily disagree. I just wanted to gauge that quickly because you mentioned it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's
move on. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to a game that I think is going to be very interesting. It's not necessarily your game of the week, but you've got 2 4-win football teams, the 4-3 Raiders and the 4-4 Steelers, both in divisions where the team above them is undefeated. So like I said about the Steelers, and I'll say it again for the Steelers and also for the Raiders, they are going to make the playoffs as a wild card team. It's not going to happen by winning the division. So both of these teams need this win in order to stay ahead in the wild card hunt. So with that said, we touched on both of these teams earlier today, so it's appropriate that we include this game. I've got to tell you, I really like how the Raiders have really come together this season. I know they've had a couple really close competitive games where they fell just short, and they could be easily 5-2 right now. But I really like this Oakland team. I think they're going to go on the road and surprise the Steelers. I think kind of like the Panthers, not many people are on the Raiders bandwagon yet, but I think they can go out there and do some things to the Steelers, especially with a one-sided offense now. I think the Raiders go out there and get it done and pull out a W and stay ahead in this wild card hunt.
I agree, and I wouldn't even necessarily call this an upset. I think the Raiders are a better team. I think Derek Carr is playing – he's playing like one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Amari Cooper is – it seems like every week he's finding a way to embarrass an opposing player in the secondary. Latavius Murray's offering them great balance. Yeah. Aldon Smith and Khalil Mack are starting to get going. And while I mentioned that the Steelers are still in excellent position for playoff position, they just lost their number. They have DeAngelo Williams, but they just lost their best tool for balance. So guys like Smith and Mack are going to be able to go off and tee off on Roethlisberger. Yeah, I like the Raiders as well on the road to surprise, even though I think they're the better team.
Yeah, I hear you. It's really great to see a historic franchise like the Raiders really turn things around like the way they have. Last pick here, and I think that's another one in which both of these teams, pardon me, they could do it either through the wild card or as a division winner. Look, if the Panthers beat the Packers like you and I are both predicting, and if the Vikings win this game, that NFC North is wide open for Minnesota. As they are 5-2 right now, Rams 4-3. Both of these teams were below 500 last year. Now both are above 500. So clearly both of these teams have improved drastically. Now both are trying to make a second half push. Who do you have winning this game? Look, I've got to go with the Vikings. I think Teddy Bridgewater and that Vikings offense has been playing a little bit better lately. I think the defense has had some good things here and there, nothing consistent. But for the most part, the Vikings have played much better lately. I think they're 4-1 in their last 5 games. So we are seeing a much more improved Vikings team than we did the first couple of weeks. And look, I think that NFC North is going to be wide open real soon for Minnesota or Green Bay.
I completely disagree. I'm not the biggest fan of Teddy Bridgewater, and we haven't really touched on the Vikings or Teddy on this podcast before. I just don't think he's special by any means, and he's not being helped out by a supporting cast either. Minnesota has one of the worst offensive lines in the league. I believe they're in the bottom 10 in terms of pressures and sacks. And they're about to go up against the St. Louis front that has Aaron Donald and Chris Long and
really good.
And Robert Quinn. And then on the other side, there's Todd Gurley, who, unless people forget, he was Leonard Fournette. For people who follow college football, he was Leonard Fournette before tearing his ACL. Todd Gurley's a phenomenal running back and might be. I mean, it's a 2-horse race between Todd Gurley and Amari Cooper for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Especially Todd Gurley, I believe, has 4 straight 120-yard rushing games. It feels like he's just playing. It looks like he's just playing a different game than a lot of his defenses he's playing against. Most recent was against San Francisco. So I like St. Louis. I think everything that St. Louis does well, Minnesota does takes advantage of Minnesota's weaknesses.
See, I told you this on the pod, and like you said, we haven't touched on the Vikings too much. I think in the near future they might be a heavy topic on this podcast. Just depends on how things go this week. But I told you during the season at some point, I said I had the Vikings as my number 3 seed in the NFC. I kind of had them as the NFC dark horse. A lot of people did because Adrian Peterson was coming back, and just kind of depends on whether or not you're higher or not on Teddy Bridgewater. Some are, some are not. I know you just said you were not, but I think a lot of scouts kind of miss with Teddy Bridgewater, and I think right now you're seeing a Vikings team that's far more competitive. Here's the thing about the Vikings. They have had a great team the past few years, since 2006, 2007. But look at the quarterbacks they've had over the years. Tavares Jackson, Matt Castle, a couple more. I just can't get off the Christian Ponder, another guy. Brett Favre is the only good quarterback, and we saw what happened when they got to the NFC title game. But look, we knew Brett Favre was not going to be there long term, so they had to get that championship as soon as possible, which they didn't. I think this is a new chance, really, for the Vikings to kind of be that team that they were in 2009, 2010, and be that contending team. If Green Bay starts to slip a little bit, which they might, the door's wide open, man, in that NFC North. I think that's what I like the most. That's what I'm excited the most for Teddy Bridgewater to kind of really go out there and prove the critics wrong, I think.
For me, a quarterback doesn't need – not to go off on too much of a tangent off our picks, but I don't think a quarterback necessarily needs a rocket arm. but they need to be able to make every throw. Tom Brady doesn't have a rocket arm, but he can dart one in there when he has to. Teddy, even watching him this past Sunday, a lot of his passes just lame ducks, and the Bears defense, which by all measures is one of the worst in the league right now in terms of especially getting up fourth quarter leads, they locked down that offense, and this is something that's been a common theme for the Vikings offense. They were locked down for a good portion of the game. And even if Teddy does start playing well, that offensive line, the Minnesota needs to completely revamp their entire offensive line. I still think they're a step away. I disagree. I don't think the roster is nowhere near as good as their 2009 2010. I mean, that team had
that was a great team.
That was a great team. They had 7 or 8 Pro Bowl players. They had 4 or 5 All Pros. I mean, that was a really great team. Minnesota is probably a year or two away, so that's why I'm not even with Teddy. But so I'm not fully on that ship yet. But I agree with you. They're on the upswing.
I think having Adrian Peterson back is huge. It kind of took him a little bit of time. I know the first game he had against San Francisco, it wasn't necessarily the greatest game, but he's had a couple 100-yard games this year, 3 if I'm not mistaken. So Peterson's definitely back into the role, and I think that's definitely helped Minnesota really just turn things around. So we'll see how things go with the Vikings and that NFC North division. That'll do it for this edition of the No Coast Bias podcast. Robert Zaglinski and I. Robert, before we sign off, let people know how they can follow you on Twitter and what should they look forward to on nocoastbias.com from you.
You can follow me on Twitter at zigzags82, the capital Z to both, lowercase everything else, 82. And look for an article on Jay Cutler coming up and the development of young quarterbacks. We had this conversation a few weeks ago. And look for the Super Bowl we deserve articles. That's just a teaser. Pretty much there.
All right, awesome. You guys can follow me on Twitter at Farzine21, and I'll be writing a piece on Kansas City sports. Obviously, Robert and I touched on this. It's crazy because Kansas City really has been would you agree Kansas City has been a bad sports town? I mean, we haven't seen a lot of championships here. From your vantage point, I think you could agree. Kansas City just hasn't been a great sports town. Would you?
Well, when your MLS team is, like you mentioned, is the flagship franchise of championships, I mean, I can see that now. I didn't think about it much before, but you gave me that perspective. I can kind of see it now. The Chiefs, their last Super Bowl was what? Super Bowl 4?
19, yeah, exactly, 1970. So I'll be touching on that. Obviously, like we touched on earlier, today was a crazy day in Kansas City with the parade. Reportedly 800,000 people showed up. And it's really a special moment for Kansas City because they've never experienced this as a sports city. So crazy fan base. The fans here love their sports. They're known to be some of the loudest. The Jayhawks, the Chiefs. I mean, they're tabbed as some of the loudest fans for their teams. But this Royals team brought a lot of things. So I'll definitely write about that on nocoastbias.com. So keep an eye out on that. Once again, I'm Farzine Vasugian. He is Robert Zaglinski. Hopefully we get our panel of 4 back next week, or at least add someone back and continue our podcast here on nocoastbias.com. Until then, have a good week. See you then.